What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Something unusual is happening across several layers of the Russia-Ukraine war right now. A Ukrainian strike on a military factory inside Russia. Analysts warning about a possible new Russian offensive preparation along the front line. Reports that Ukraine has recorded its first territorial gains ever since 2023. Naval activity shifting across the Black Sea. Russian submarines quietly disappearing from one of the most strategically important bodies of water in Europe. Oil revenues then also unexpectedly boosting Moscow's state budget. At the same time, the Russian government preparing spending cuts that signal pressure building beneath the surface of the war economy. Each one of these developments by itself might look like just another daily update in a conflict that has now lasted more than 4 years. But when you place them next to each other and step back to just look at the bigger strategic picture, a much more interesting pattern begins to emerge. The pattern suggesting that the war may be entering a new phase, where battlefield dynamics, naval strategy, economic pressures and geopolitical shifts are all beginning to intersect in ways that could shape what happens next. So today, let's walk through several major developments that unfolded over the last 24 hours. Beginning with a Ukrainian strike that reportedly targeted a key Russian military facility connected to missile production. Moving next, we're gonna go into the latest battlefield assessment from the Institute for the Study of War about Russian offensive preparations. Then we're gonna be examining reports that Ukraine has recorded its first territorial gains in more than a year, while Russian units face mounting operational difficulties, before shifting our attention to the naval dimensions of the war in the Black Sea, where Ukraine has been intensifying pressure on Russia's naval assets and where something unusual appears to be happening with Russian submarines. After that, we will move beyond the battlefield itself and take a closer look at Russia's war economy, including new data showing that rising oil prices are unexpectedly boosting Moscow's tax revenues, even as the Russian government quietly prepares a potential 10% reduction in non-military spending. And finally, we will connect all of these dots together to understand what they may tell us about the strategic trajectory of the war over the coming months. Because when you examine the battlefield, the navy, the economy, and the geopolitical environment, all at the same time, not just separately, you begin to see a conflict that may be shifting in a very subtle but very important ways. Let's begin with the development that immediately caught the attention of analysts across entire Europe this week, which is basically Ukraine's claim that it successfully struck a key Russian military factory in Bryansk connected to missile production. According to reporting by France 24, Ukrainian officials said that a missile strike targeted a Russian military facility believed to be involved in the production of weapons used by Moscow's armed forces during the war. That's almost a literal quote. Ukrainian sources described the target as a key military factory, suggesting that the strike was intended not simply as a tactical attack, but as a part of a broader strategy aimed at disrupting Russia's defense industrial base. Even though precise operational details remain limited, obviously, what makes this development particularly significant is the type of strategy it reflects. Because throughout the earlier phases of the war, Ukrainian long-range operations primarily focused on ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, and logistical hubs located close to the front lines. We've seen hundreds of news like this. But over the past year, that strategy has gradually evolved towards something much more ambitious, targeting the infrastructure itself that supports Russia's ability to sustain the war over time. Facilities connected to missile production, aircraft repair, and weapons manufacturing represent an entirely different category of targets comparing to just mere frontline supply depots, because they are just deeply integrated into Russia's military industrial system. And for obvious reasons, replacing them will not be so easy. Unlike ammunition storage sites that can be just rebuilt effectively and relatively quickly, or just dispersed across multiple locations. But on the other hand, these large defense manufacturing facilities require specialized equipment, trained engineers, and very complex supply chains that often depend on components imported from other countries to make things worse for Russia. That means that when one of those facilities is damaged or temporarily disrupted or even fully destroyed, the impact can and most likely will ripple across the entire production network. Now it is important to note that Russia's defense industry remains vast, and Moscow has spent the past 2 years at least expanding production capacity for artillery shells, drones and missiles. But the key strategic point here is that Ukraine's growing ability to reach targets deeper inside Russian territory forces Moscow now to divert resources towards protecting those industrial infrastructure that previously operated far from the battlefield and was considered to be safe. And that alone can reshape how a war is fought. Because if Ukraine can consistently threaten the facilities that produce the weapons used on the battlefield, that the conflict gradually shifts from the purely tactical contest over territory, over land, over villages, into a strategic contest over industrial capacity itself. And that brings us directly to the next chapter, because while Ukraine appears to be expanding its reach behind Russian lines, analysts are simultaneously warning that Moscow may be preparing its own new push along multiple front lines. Every day, analysts track thousands of small developments across the front lines in Ukraine. Yet occasionally patterns begin to emerge that suggest a larger operational shift that may be happening. That is exactly what the Institute for the Study of War suggested in its latest Russian offensive campaign assessment, where analysts pointed to several indicators suggesting that Russian forces could be preparing for a new offensive activity. According to the report, Russian units have continued concentrated attacks along multiple sectors of the front lines, particularly in areas of eastern Ukraine, where Moscow has spent months attempting to grind forward through Ukrainian defensive positions. These operations involve large quantities of artillery, extensive drone reconnaissance, and repeated mechanized assault designed to gradually wear down Ukrainian defensive lines. And yet, despite the scale of these operations, progress has been just slow and costly. The Institute for the Study of War analysts noted that Russian forces continue attempting to exploit tactical openings in sectors such as Donetsk and its surrounding regions, while simultaneously adjusting operational tactics based on lessons learned from earlier phases of the war. And one such key factor shaping these operations is Russia's growing reliance on drones for battlefield reconnaissance and also targeting, which has dramatically increased the transparency of the battlefield, not just for Russia, but primarily also for Ukraine. So now both sides operate thousands of small unmanned aerial systems that constantly scan the front lines, meaning that large troop movements or equipment concentrations can be detected with much faster ease, just much faster in general than in previous wars. This has obviously forced both armies to adapt. Russian units increasingly rely on smaller assault groups supported by drones and artillery, rather than large armored formations, just going in hundreds of them. While Ukrainian forces have built extensive defensive networks designed to slow down and fragment those advancing units in return. Yet, even in this highly monitored battlefield environment, momentum still can shift very quickly. And that is where the next development becomes particularly interesting, because while analysts warn about potential Russian offensive preparations, new reporting suggests that Ukraine has recently achieved something it had not managed to accomplish in quite some time. Let's talk about next. And by the way, speaking about the frontline changes, I have some combat footage once again for you guys. It will be uploaded to my Patreon, the link is down below, so if you are curious to see it, your memberships are the best way to support our channel. And also get, well, something in return. Thanks so much, now let's continue. For much of the past year, the war in Ukraine has been characterized by incremental advances measured in small distances, meters sometimes, with both sides spending enormous resources to gain control over relatively limited pieces of territory and land. That is why the latest reporting from Al Jazeera drew attention across military circles, because Ukrainian officials indicated that their forces had recently recorded territorial gains, the very first such progress reported since 2023, 2.5, almost 3 years ago. Parts of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions were liberated, amounting to 460 square kilometers, approximately 120 square miles, or 10% of what Kyiv lost to Moscow in 25. According to Ukrainian sources, several areas of the front line saw localized advances, where Ukrainian units were able to push Russian forces back from previously contested positions. Even though these gains were not massive in scale, their significance lies in the broader operational context, because for months Russian forces have attempted to maintain pressure across multiple sectors of the front, often advancing slowly through attritional tactics designed to exploit numerical advantages in manpower and artillery. But the recent Ukrainian advances suggest that those Russian efforts may be encountering increasing resistance. Reports indicate that Russian units in certain sectors have faced logistical challenges, coordination difficulties, and growing operational strain under sustained offensive activity. At the same time, Ukraine has continued adapting its defensive and offensive tactics, integrating drones, precision strikes, and flexible maneuver units capable of responding quickly to changing battlefield conditions. And as talked previously, these conditions can change very rapidly. The result is just a battlefield that remains highly fluid, where small tactical successes can accumulate into larger strategic shifts over time. And yet, while much of the world focuses on land battles across the front lines, another dimension of the war has been evolving quietly in the background: the naval theater of the Black Sea. And recent events there suggest that Ukraine's strategy may be reshaping naval dynamics in ways that very few analysts expected at the beginning of this war. Let's talk about it in our next chapter. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Russian Black Sea Fleet appeared to hold overwhelming naval superiority. I mean, after all, Ukraine possessed only a small navy, limited coastal defense assets, and almost no traditional warships capable of challenging Russia's fleet directly. And yet, over the past 2 years, even I would say almost 4 years, because Russian fleet was on the bottom of the sea since then, all this changed dramatically. According to reporting by Naval News, Ukraine has been steadily intensifying strikes against Russian naval assets across the entire Black Sea region. This is in addition to the attack against 2 frigates we talked about yesterday. But these new operations include the use of long-range drones, maritime drones, and precision strike systems capable of targeting ships, ports, and logistical infrastructure. And the cumulative effect has been very significant. Several Russian naval vessels have been damaged or even forced to relocate to ports further from Ukrainian strike range, such as Novorossiysk, while coastal facilities that support fleet operations have increasingly come under pressure. In practical terms, this has forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to operate way more cautiously than it did earlier in the war. Instead of maintaining constant presence, for example, across large portions of the sea, Russian naval units now often operate from protected ports or conduct missions at a way greater distance from Ukrainian coastline. Basically meaning that if they launch missiles, they will be much earlier detected and intercepted. And that brings us to another curious development that has emerged in recent days. One that analysts are still trying to fully understand. Because according to reports from RBK Ukraine, something unusual appears to be happening with Russia's submarine activity in the Black Sea, the topic of our next chapter. Submarines have long been one of the most strategically valuable components of Russia's naval forces in the Black Sea. Unlike surface ships, which are more vulnerable to drone attacks and missile strikes, submarines can operate stealthily beneath the surface while still launching cruise missiles capable of striking targets hundreds, if not thousands, kilometers away. That is why recent reports suggesting that Russian submarines appear to be, quote, vanishing from regular operational patterns in the Black Sea, that's why this attracted considerable attention from media around the world. For example, according to the RBK Ukraine, analysts tracking Russian naval activity observed a noticeable absence of submarine deployments that had previously been common during earlier phases of the war. And, well, we have to ask the question why. For example, there are potentially several, at least 3 possible explanations for this. One possibility is that Russian commanders are deliberately repositioning submarines to avoid potential Ukrainian surveillance or attack capabilities. Most likely that is the case. Another is that maintenance cycle or logistical adjustments are temporarily limiting deployments. But then a third explanation is perhaps the most intriguing, not necessarily the correct one, but intriguing at least, that the growing effectiveness of Ukrainian naval drones and surveillance technologies may be altering how Russia uses its submarines just altogether. Because, if underwater assets are increasingly at risk of detention or interference, well, then their operational role could shift in ways that change naval strategy across the entire region completely. And while these developments continue unfolding at sea, another set of numbers far from the battlefield is shaping the war in a completely different way. Because behind every artillery shell, every drone flight, and every military deployment lies the very same fundamental question. Just how long can a country afford to sustain a war? We're gonna answer this question right now. Wars are often decided not only by what happens on the battlefield, but by what happens in financial markets thousands of kilometers away. And according to a new report from Reuters, global oil prices are currently providing an unexpected boost to Russia's war economy. The report noted that the price used for calculating Russia's oil taxation has recently exceeded the level assumed in the country's state entire budget. That obviously means that Moscow is collecting more revenue from energy exports than planners originally anticipated. Unfortunately. And for a country heavily dependent on energy exports, even relatively small changes in global oil prices can translate into billions of additional dollars flowing into government coffers. They're not going to be spent on infrastructure, of course. It's just war money. And in the context of a large-scale war, that extra revenue can help sustain military spending, finance weapons production, and support broader economic stability, but not gonna go to the people, obviously, as you would expect. Yet, the picture is not entirely straightforward, because while higher oil prices can temporarily strengthen Russia's fiscal position, other economic indicators suggest that pressure may still be building behind the scenes. Which leads us directly to the final development on today's briefing. Despite the additional revenue generated by higher oil prices, Reuters reported that the Russian government is quietly preparing plans to reduce non-military spending by approximately 10%. These potential cuts would apply to areas of the federal budget not directly connected to national security or defense programs. Of course, who would expect otherwise, right? In other words, while military spending remains a priority, other sectors of the economy may begin absorbing the financial strain created by the war itself. That is the pattern historically seen in many prolonged conflicts. Governments often protect military expenditures at all costs, while shifting economic pressure into civilian sectors. The challenge for policymakers is that such adjustments can gradually accumulate social and economic consequences over time. If public services, infrastructure investment, or regional budgets begin experiencing reductions, those changes can ripple across society in ways that are difficult to reverse quickly. Because when you combine battlefield dynamics, naval developments, industrial strikes, and economic pressures, you begin to see a conflict evolving across multiple front lines simultaneously. Over the last 24 hours, we have seen Ukraine claim a strike on a key Russian military factory. Analysts warn about potential new Russian offensive preparations. Reports indicating Ukraine's first ever territorial gains since 2023. Growing pressure on Russian naval assets in the Black Sea. Unusual submarine activity raising new questions about naval strategy. And economic dense signals showing both unexpected oil revenue gains while simultaneously forcing Russia for possible spending cuts for the Russian budget. Individually, these developments and news might appear a routine in just war that have now entered its 5th year, but when viewed together, they suggest a much more complex strategic picture, one where battlefield operations, naval dynamics, industrial capacity, and economic sustainability are all intersecting and interconnected in ways that could shape the next phase of the conflict. And as these trends continue evolving, the key question will not simply be who controls the next piece of territory on the map, who captures this village, or even who wins the war potentially, but which side can adapt faster to the changing realities of modern warfare, which once again inevitably will lead to a victory. So guys, if you want to stay updated on how this story continues to unfold, please make sure you subscribe. Don't forget about the Patreon, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.